little bit, not to give you too much topic whiplash, but we just had some nice deep dive into Kafka. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the psychology around incident response. And we're also going to talk about zebras a little bit, but trust me, it'll make sense. So just a couple things that I like to cover quickly. In this talk, I talk a little bit about trauma and post-traumatic stress. We don't talk about any specific trauma stuff, but I always like to make sure people are aware of that. And another disclaimer, the second, while I'm a trauma survivor, I am not a mental health professional, so none of this is actual medical advice. So, don't call your lawyers or anything like that. Cool, so who am I, right? So my name is Matt Stratton. I'm fairly well known in the DevOps community, primarily because I really like Diet Coke. I work for PagerDuty. How many people here are familiar or have heard of PagerDuty? Okay, cool. Then I did my job that paid for PagerDuty, paying for me to come here. That's pretty much probably the last time we're going to talk about PagerDuty, except for maybe some stories I might tell around how we do things at PagerDuty. And according to Ryan Kitchens and Netflix, I have the best hair of all developer advocates. So this is my equivalent of a resume slide. A lot of times people like to say, this is why you should listen to me. Apparently, I think you should listen to me because I like Diet Coke. So I don't know.
Pay you for this ad?
They should, right? My validation is that Dr. Forsgren that we heard from yesterday also really loves Diet Coke. So if Nicole does it, then it's got to be right. So cool, right? All right, so let's talk about zebras. So if we think about a zebra that's at rest, just sort of chilling out there on the savannah, there's no threat of predators. It's operating within what we call the rest and digest function of the parasympathetic nervous system, right? It's just kind of hanging out there. It literally is resting, digesting, eating grass, everything's cool. Enter a lion, right? So now the zebra's being chased by a lion. So there are drastic changes to the zebra's body that happen with the activation of what's called the fight or flight response of the sympathetic nervous system. So the heart rate increases, its breathing rate increases, right? There's large amounts of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline are released into the zebra's bloodstream. The pupils dilate. Any non-essential functions shut down, like digestion, right? The zebra's nervous system is preparing for it to literally run for its life, right? So it's focusing on that. Now, say the zebra gets caught. Its nervous system is now overwhelmed, right? It has no further solutions. This is called freeze. It basically plays dead, right? So the lion then drops the zebra, goes to maybe try to catch another one. So maybe the zebra gets away. And does anybody know what the zebra does as soon as it gets away? It shakes. It literally shakes. It shakes it off. And it resets its nervous system back to that rest and digest, and it just continues to move on as if nothing had happened. That's how zebras do it. Now, if there's one thing that you take away from this entire DevOpsDays Tel Aviv conference, it's going to be this next point. So you might want to get your cameras ready. This is probably the most important slide. You will see it at any DevOps conference this year. And I can say that. And it is this. Humans are not zebras, right? So if you learn nothing else, it's that we are not zebras. So we don't respond the same way to things like this, right? So this thing we call the autonomic nervous system, which is fight or flight, it's common to all mammals, right? So all mammals have that. But we have this thing called a prefrontal cortex, right? And zebras and other mammals don't have it. And usually this prefrontal cortex is an advantage. This is where executive function happens. It's because of this that we can do pattern recognition. We can understand the difference between good and bad, same and different. We can understand consequences because of this prefrontal cortex. The problem is, this is also where we mentally replay traumatic scenarios, right? And that activates our sympathetic nervous system. It activates our body the same way that a real threat does. One of the things that's amazing about humans is our brains are incredibly intelligent and really super smart, and they're also really, really dumb, okay? They can't tell the difference between real and perceived threat, whereas zebras can. So Dr. Peter Levine, who's a psychologist who's done a lot of work around post-traumatic stress, and also who I stole the zebra metaphor from, said, animals in the wild are not traumatized by routine threats to their lives. This happens all the time. If you're a zebra, you get chased by lions a lot. They aren't traumatized by it. They shake it off, they move on. But humans, we can be overwhelmed, and we're subject to symptoms like hyperarousal, shutdown, and dysregulation. This is a thing. And another way to look at it is we think about this idea, this is something called the window of tolerance. So this isn't a healthy nervous system. Something happens, we get activated, our sympathetic nervous system kicks in, again, just like it does with the zebra, and then the thing that was upsetting stops, and then we go back and we settle and we continue to move. And this is a healthy nervous system. And this area where we live inside of this is called the window of tolerance, right? This is emotional arousal that's optimal for well-being and effective functioning. Okay, so we have this little window of tolerance. What happens with trauma? It looks a little more like this, right? So when a traumatic event occurs, something that our nervous system is not prepared to be able to respond to, and it comes in there, instead of kind of being in this easy little parabola, right? We have this spiky looking graph, and this looks like a really bad Nagios monitor. And so I'm making connections, it works, right? So we can either be going up and down, right, on either end, or we can get stuck on or stuck off, and these things are pretty common, being stuck in either way. So if we're stuck on, that's where we see symptoms around anxiety, right? The inability to relax, restlessness, hypervigilance, digestive problems, which makes sense because, again, it's changing our physiology. If we get stuck off, that's where we see things like depression and lethargy, and again, more digestive problems. It's like these things are connected. So what does this have to do with anything, right? So the first thing to bear in mind is trauma is not simple, right? It seems like it is, and it's just like the systems we work with today, right? Like we used to deal with very simple systems. Our systems are complex today, and trauma, just like our systems that we work with, are not simple. So a couple things to think about, right? So trauma happens because your nervous system is overwhelmed. That's the difference. The exact same thing can be traumatic to you and maybe not at a different time because of how your nervous system responds. And it's the same for real and imagined threats. Like I said, it can be a real threat or a perceived threat. Your physiology, your body, and your nervous system are going to respond the same. And it's also subjective and relative. And this is really, really key. What I perceive as overwhelming, or my capacity for a solution, may be different than what you perceive as overwhelming. So what does this have to do with companies and organizations, right? You're like, we didn't come for a mental health conference here. We want to talk about how our teams and our organizations can be better. And the story behind this talk was when I was starting to learn about post-traumatic stress, and I was going through treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, a lot of this sounded really similar to how all the companies and teams that I work with around incident response, that we can behave really, really similarly. So if we go back and we think about this idea of a dysregulated nervous system, how is this similar to what happens in a company or an organization when a traumatic event occurs, which in this case might be just an incident or an outage? It's like trauma, right? So something happens. And where those places come in, again, is we think about the difference inside that window of tolerance. So there's this first idea is being hyper-aroused. That's being stuck on, up the upside, the top part of the graph of the window of tolerance. This is being stuck in fight or flight, right? And so an organization that's hyper-aroused, that this is how their response to incidents and outages, they display effects of constant vigilance, right? It sounds like they're fighting Voldemort. We're hyper aware of threats. Everyone's out to get us. And this takes energy away from moving forward. If we're always kind of looking over our shoulder and concerned that everything is a potential downside of thing that can happen, we're never going to want to do. We're not putting energy into innovating, right? This can be reflected. We can see this in how leadership in your organization approaches outages and incidents. We see a lot of wartime metaphors in those. Production support teams. How many people have been in an organization where you have a team that's dedicated just to fixing production bugs outside of the delivery team? We're at a DevOps conference, so we kind of understand we don't want to do that anymore. But usually organizations that are stuck on will have devoted teams that do nothing but fixing broken shit. That doesn't work out too well, right? And then we can be on the other side. We can be hypo aroused. This is being stuck off. This is being stuck in freeze. And this is this idea where, again, we can't move forward because we're frozen. Because if we change, something bad is going to happen, right? This is how we respond to incidents, is by not ever doing anything, then nothing bad will happen. And this sounds a little silly, but I think we can all think of a company that we probably worked at one time where this was true, right? So we want to think about how we respond, right? We talked about how our nervous system responds to trauma. What are healthier ways for an organization to respond? So one of the things that can happen is we see a signal that looks similar to a thing that happened before. And then we think it's the same thing again, right? Like last time this happened, again, think about how your nervous system responds to trauma, right? Like something that reminds your nervous system of this traumatic thing is going to cause the same response. We do this in organizations. We see something starting to shape a certain way, and we're like, this looks like the last time this happened. Again, our systems are complex. And there was a time decades ago in my career where I used to say I could tell a good sysadmin because they would sit there and shake their head and stroke their chin and say, I've seen this before. That doesn't work so well in today's distributed and complex systems, because just because you've seen this before does not mean it's the same thing again, right? And complexity is what makes this challenging. So one way to think about this a little bit, I give this talk a lot. This is the first time I'm giving it in Israel. It's kind of a little bit funny, and you'll see why. Because I usually ask how many people flew on a plane to get here. Probably not too many people. But so we think about this idea about how we have to take our shoes off when we're boarding a plane, right? Or when we're going through an airport. And I understand that things are a little different in the airport here. It's probably a little more effective, so it's kind of funny for me to be in Israel talking about ineffectiveness of airport security. Normally, this is a funny thing, right? But let's think about the pattern of what happened, right? So if you don't know, on December 22nd of 2001, this cat named Richard Reed tried to ignite explosives in his shoes from a flight from Paris to Miami. So as a result, in the States, the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, began randomly searching people's shoes, right? And then in 2006, they mandated that all passengers had to remove their shoes. Then a few years ago, they said, well, if you give us $100, you don't have to take your shoes off anymore. So that's a whole other problem. By the way, money well spent for those of us that, spend all our lives on airplanes. So, but what was the response here? This, again, was sort of trying to do some pattern matching. It was like, well, one dude put some explosives in his shoes, so therefore all shoes are suspect. And no incident has looked like that since then, right? But it sounds a little silly, but we do this a lot when we think about incidents that occur in our organization, where we're like, okay, we saw this particular monitor doing this before, so this means that it's this same defect. And it's not necessarily, because, again, we put it in the Wayback Machine and we think back to our lamp stack days, there were like 3 connections that happened, right? So there is not too many different possible things. I mean, for crying out loud, we just heard about 1,400 different microservices at Wix. Okay, pretty sure that every single thing that happens is a different layer of complexity. So think about it this way, right? So Jennifer Brea has said, we have a saying in medicine that when you hear hoofbeats, the first thing that should come to mind is a horse, not a zebra. How many people have heard that saying before, right? Okay. The problem is, as Jennifer says, this cute phrase has killed many zebras. Because the thing is, sometimes it's a zebra. And if we're operating under this assumption that it's always a horse because it's a horse a lot of the times, we're going to miss the zebras. Also, look, see, this is the second time zebras are in this talk. So this is a lot about this idea of sort of jumping on this, looking for a root cause when we're thinking about incidents, right? We're like, aha, okay, there is a single thing that caused this incident, and last time it kind of looked like this, so it's probably the same thing. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but I'm not going to have a whole talk about contributing factors and root causes, because that's a different talk. But how do we understand our organization's window of tolerance? Because remember, it's different for every company. Every company has a different window of tolerance for incidents and outages. How can we identify when we are dysregulated? And that's one of the little takeaways from this I want you to think about, is what are some of the things that your team can do? Like, how can you identify if you are becoming more stuck on or more stuck off, right? So we talked a little bit about what Dr. Levine said, and there's a similar quote which says, resilient organizations are not traumatized by routine threats to their mission or business, right? Non-resilient organizations are readily overwhelmed, and they're often subject to the symptoms of overreaction, shutdown, and lack of regulated effort, right? Again, we've heard this before in other talks this week. This is going to happen, right? You're going to have incidents. You're going to have outages. Is this something that's going to traumatize your organization or something you're going to be able to move along? And who said this? It was me. I am not a doctor. But you have to quote yourself in a talk, is a lesson that I learned. Right, okay, so how do we take a deregulated state and become regulated? So we talked about the problem, right? We said, okay, you're like, great, so we're dysregulated. We would very much like to not be that. How can we do that? So now we're going to talk about some actionable things. And so in post-traumatic stress treatment in individuals, there's a treatment method called somatic experiencing. And somatic experiencing, it's a form of alternative therapy that's aimed at relieving the symptoms of post-traumatic stress and other mental and physical trauma-related health problems by focusing on body sensations. And it was created by the trauma therapist, Dr. Peter Levine. And so I've had this treatment, and this was where, when I started thinking about it, the idea is that we're starting with the body. That's what soma means, right? It's about the body. And in traditional post-traumatic stress treatment, it's a lot of talk therapy, and it's top-down. We're talking about why did this happen? Why do we have trauma? If we can understand where the trauma came from, we'll get better. And what we're doing in somatic experiencing is we're actually saying, let's lead with the body. What is the physiological response we want to have? And then how do we connect it to our memories and of these traumatic experiences? So what we want to do for organizational somatic experiencing is create a similar focus on the response to train ourselves to have the reactions we'd like to have when we have an incident or an outage, right? Again, this is something we're going to happen, and we want to create that physiological association. We're never going to make incidents stress-free. They're plenty stressful. It's a thing that's going to happen. But we want to reduce that. And one of the main reasons we want to do this is the number one most important thing about effective incident response is 2 words. And those 2 words are don't panic, right? So no matter what's happening, we want to be able to have effective incident response. We need to reduce panic, and reducing stress will help with that. Okay, cool. So when we think about somatic, we say that's body first, right? We don't start with the mind. If we start with the mind, that's sort of like looking for the singular root cause during an incident. The first thing to bear in mind is during an incident, we actually don't really care about what's going wrong. What we care about is restoring service. We're going to try to figure out all that stuff later. So bear in mind that there's never going to be one singular cause. There are contributing factors, and this is similar to the nuance and the relativity of trauma, right? The exact same thing that happens to me, you might have a different experience when it happens to you, and vice versa. And that's similarly that we might say, well, the root cause was that somebody messed up this chef configuration. Well, how did that happen? What were the contributing factors? Was the person tired? Was the person not trained? And it's actually probably a lot of these things together. So a lot of it is thinking about the fact that our systems are complex. There's always something broken. And what's different today is different than tomorrow. So let's think about some of these. Again, fundamentally, there is but one root cause, and that root cause is the Big Bang, right? So move on. Okay, cool. So then we think about contributing factors, right? So how do we do things to make an association with outages and issues into that more of a safe place, right? And a place so we are, as responders, as people that have to respond to incidents, they're less stressful, right? So one of the ways we can do this is with game days, right? Where we're basically practicing incident response, among other things. And game days can be helpful with this, but we have to do them properly, right? They need to be low stress and safe. The point is not to practice decision-making under stress. And I'll give an example. At PagerDuty, we do these things we call Failure Fridays. And they're a game day where we break something on purpose, we know what we're doing, and then we run it like a true incident. And recently, it came up that the folks participating, the incident commander and everything like that, shouldn't know what the plan was. We shouldn't know what system we're testing, right? Shouldn't know the failure we're injecting. And I fought pretty hard about this, and good news is I won. Because I said, the goal of this is not to practice being stressed out. We will get plenty of practice being stressed out. We're actually trying to do the opposite. We're trying to associate our practices of incident response with not being stressed out. So when we're doing this exploration in a game day, it's kind of like you need to have guidance. It's a little bit like meditation, right? So with some kinds of trauma, meditation can be really helpful. It can. The problem is, if you aren't guided through this meditation, you're not going to really get the best benefit out of it, right? So sooner or later, you're going through this medication. Medication helps too, but I don't have any good metaphors for that, other than buy PagerDuty. But when you're going through meditation, you may encounter a memory of your trauma, right? And if you're not guided, what happens, right? You might be overwhelmed by it, you might avoid it. And so the same thing, if our game day is not following the usual rules, we aren't creating that proper association. So if we do planned failure injection in a game day, and sometimes we call this chaos engineering and whatever, but really this is very specific around this particular concept. So again, this is what we do at PagerDuty on our Failure Fridays, which actually we do them on any day, but we used to only do them on Fridays, and it's fun to say Failure Friday rather than Failure Any Day, so we still call it Failure Friday. But the whole point is we run them like a real incident, right? We have an incident commander, we run them through PagerDuty, we do a postmortem, we do everything, even though we know exactly what went wrong, quote unquote, what went wrong, because we did it on purpose. So this creates this organizational association that incidents and incident response is just this thing we do, man. We just do this every Friday. You know, we get on a bridge and we go into PagerDuty and we have a scribe and we do all the things so that when it happens at 2 a.m, yeah, it sucks because it's 2 a.m, but we're just really used to doing it and it's got this association. This is also why we do game days during the middle of the day. Because to be honest, there's no good time for PagerDuty to be down, right? Like, y'all who use PagerDuty don't ever want us to be down. That would be really sad. In fact, the worst time for PagerDuty to be down is the middle of the night for us, right? So the best time, if we're going to take an outage, is during the day, San Francisco time, when the majority of our engineers are awake and around. So that's when we run our game days. So this is another reason why I believe very strongly in that you run all of your incidents at their initial severity, right? Even if you start them and realize, hey, this actually wasn't an incident, or we thought this was a Sev 1, but really it's a Sev 3, we like to say, you don't litigate severity during an incident, right? Part of that is because you're going to spend all your time arguing about whether or not it's really a Sev 2 or a Sev 3, and by the time you're done arguing, you're 10 minutes into a Sev 1. That's a different problem. But we want to run this to our full course. Because the thing is, let's say you kick off your incident response process and you realize this actually wasn't an incident. What's the worst thing that happens? You got practice at doing incident response. The more that we do this, the better we get at it. Practice makes permanent, but we're also creating that association. And part of the reason this is really important is because, to be quite frankly, the world of on-call we live in now is not nearly as shitty as it was 15 years ago. 10, 15 years ago, when I was on call as a sysadmin, I was responding to incidents every other night, and it was a constant thing I always did, because I was also one of the only people, and I was on call every other week. Well, now we have these beautiful things where we're on call for our own stuff, and we're part of these large rotations, and maybe you might be on call. You might get called into an incident once every 3 months, right? So what you don't want to be doing is during that time going, well, how do I even log into our incident response software anymore? I don't remember how to do this anymore, right? It's this anomaly. If we're creating it as something we do all the time, it's just business as usual. And we need to process this failure, right? So we talk a lot about blameless postmortems. The whole thing is we need to follow the failure and the outage through with all the information that we have, and it needs to have a conclusion, right? Otherwise, it's the same thing as unprocessed trauma. So with trauma, we need to integrate our experiences into our coherent whole. With post-incident reviews and postmortems, this includes this idea of we're telling the story. So the idea of a postmortem is not 100% just to create a bunch of Jira tickets out of that. It's how do we actually share the story? How do we actually process it? And then it comes to, and this gets us into this model of being able to actually learn more from incidents, right? A write-only postmortem doesn't help anybody, is another way I like to put it. So normally this is the time I would start talking about cognitive distortions, but I'm running out of time. So we can, if we want to talk about the psychobabble some more, we can do that offline. But really the couple things I want to kind of end with thinking about is I really love this quote from Dr. Levine, right? Which says, resilient strength is the opposite of helplessness. Being resilient as a person means that we don't see things from the perspective of things that happen to us. It's a matter of what we can do going forward, right? And as an organization, it's the same thing. Incidents happen, but what do we do going forward? How do we learn from them? And a culture of blame leads to a culture of helplessness, and that's the worst place we want to be. We don't want to feel like in our organization, in our team, we are helpless and we cannot make things better. And being able to move forward past that stuff is really what's key. So I've got a bunch of supporting links if you want to learn more about this stuff on my speaking website, as well as the slides and all this great stuff. So thank you for having me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of DevOpsDays Tel Aviv.